All right, praising God this time for, among other things, forgiveness and clearer vision. Forgiveness because, current events aside, I have not been in the best mood today, and I need forgiveness for that mood. So thank God for the second thing, clearer vision. Understanding that last night I made a mistake in Wednesday night class, forgetting that there are other nations beyond or places beyond Tyre, Sidon, and Egypt caught up in the judgment that God is talking about this week. One of our brothers helped me to see that there are a larger number of nations that are wrapped up in the judgment from these 7 chapters, specifically this chapter, chapter 30, reminding me of what we talked about in the last chapter, the way in which Egypt was a disappointment to Israel, overselling their ability to provide cover and help for Israel, who leaned on them in a time of need, only to be disappointed by Egypt's failure to actually help. Even though they tried to help, they weren't what they claimed to be, essentially. Reminding us of what we talked about last night, the need to, as I had an old boss say, Marcus, as best you can, undersell and over-deliver. Anyway, moving past that preamble, thank you for that, brother, for helping me to understand that beyond Israel's dependence upon Egypt that proved faulty, there are a host of nations in chapter 30 who are going to prove to depend on Egypt to their disappointment and their own fall. Understanding that they are going to get caught up in the judgment coming to Egypt, let's call this chapter Helpers. Understanding that God is promising not only condemnation to Egypt for the wrongs they have done, but those who have helped them in that wrongdoing. In this chapter that did not seem all that clear to me in the beginning, understanding, like I said, might have been my mood. But eventually it seems like it may be relatively straightforward in its organization. Understanding that in the first portion, we'll call it, he is talking about the destruction that is coming to Egypt and those helpers in the first 9 verses, going on to describe the destruction coming to Egypt, particularly in that second set of chapters running from verses 10 on through about verse 19. It is going to end up talking about the decline in strength of Egypt as God strengthens the nation, once again, Babylon through Nebuchadnezzar, that he is coming to use in dealing with Egypt. But taking it a little bit more slowly, in the first 9 verses, as we mentioned, twice he is going to mention some of the nations that are caught up in Israel's judgment. Verse 5 in particular, Cush and Put and Lud and all Arabia and Libya, and the people of the land that is in league shall fall with them, that is Egypt, by the sword. Skipping again, he's going to repeat that. Similarly, in verse 8, he'll say, then they will know that I am the Lord when I have set fire to Egypt and all her helpers are broken. Going again to name Cush in particular in verse 9, specifically naming them as being caught unsuspecting, understanding there are times in life when, as we have mentioned, it can be dangerous to get away with wrongdoing because we begin to assume that it's just okay. And so in this judgment, Cush is being described as caught unaware by the judgment that comes to Egypt and gets them presumably wrapped up in Egypt's fall as well. As verses 10 through 19 specifically itemize some of the things at which God is going or things God is about to specifically destroy within Egypt. Naming in verse 10, he's going to put an end to the wealth of Egypt. Beginning about verse 13, he's going to describe the way in which he will destroy the idols and the images of Egypt. Going on in verses 14 through 19 to itemize the cities or the places in Egypt that are going to fall, specifically seeming to itemize at least some of those as the strongholds of Egypt in verse 15. As he concludes that section of verse 19 saying, thus or in this way he will execute judgments on Egypt and they will know that he is the Lord, a recurring phrase that we have seen throughout the judgments that God is pronouncing both on his people and the nations around them, as we talked briefly about on Wednesday, saying that God knows how to reach all of us in a way that we will understand, understanding that these nations are unique. He understands the way that he can reach Israel and Judah and Egypt and Cush, etc., in a way that they will all clearly understand whether or not they choose to retain in their minds and in their hearts the acknowledgement that they will make on the day of the Lord. Going on, though, the last section of verses 20 through 26, as we mentioned, talks about the destruction of the strength of Egypt in the form of kind of blunt illustration, talking about he is going to break the arm of Egypt and not just the one arm, understanding that it will not be given time to heal. He is then going to break the other arm of Egypt, seeming at least partially to refer to their military strength in verse 22. And I will make the sword fall from his hand, as he then goes on twice to talk about the ascent of the strength, or the way he will cause Babylon to rise in strength in verse 24, and again in verse 25, as he is also breaking the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Concluding in the last verse, and I will scatter the Egyptians among the nations and disperse them throughout the countries. Then they will know that I am the Lord. Making it clear, or seeming to make it clear, that one of the things that will get the Egyptians' attention is the destruction of their strength, in which they've quite possibly placed too much confidence. Among other things, the idols or the images, things that we have described as things that give them permission to create their own fiction about the reality that they can create, quite often through, or quite likely through, their strength. Beyond that, their strongholds, or their seemingly impenetrable cities, reminding me of some of the very same things that God is attacking in his own people, Judah, as he begins to correct their misunderstandings about life. And then finally, the first thing he actually seems to mention in the sequence of things he is removing from Egypt is their wealth. One of the things that can cause us all to have an inflated sense of security. And so in dealing with all of these false senses or false sources of confidence in Egypt, he causes Egypt to tumble, also correcting the displaced confidence that their neighbors had in them, helping us to all understand, even as Solomon lamented throughout Ecclesiastes, that wealth, power, and even wisdom in and of themselves are actually huge blessings, but absent the integrity God has called his people to maintain, they are actually disappointing blessings.